Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. So we had DC Pearson on the show a couple weeks ago, more than a couple by the time this goes up, and he told a story about how you followed him, well, not literally followed, but you came to Los Angeles after him from New York, and he says you were not feeling Los Angeles, as they say, not loving the city, not really meshing with it, and the way DC tells it, he helped you along the way by screening the Coen Brothers Barton Fink for you? Is that true? So how did that help?
Well, he showed me, DC I follow him into a lot of things culturally and across the country, apparently. But he showed me Barton Fink. He showed me a lot of Coen Brothers movies and recommended some. I'm terrible about watching movies. I've seen so few. But I think he was just trying to open me up to the idea of Los Angeles. I'd been really, I don't know about that movie particularly, how that would have helped me, but him in general, he just sort of talked me down off the ledge because I'd been pretty adamant to my agents about not moving to Los Angeles, but not wanting to leave. And because I'd worked at the Onion in New York for 3 years, and every opportunity that comes up though is in Los Angeles. So my agents kept just trying to tell me, if you want to go anywhere in this industry, you're probably going to eventually have to move to Los Angeles. And I just didn't want to hear it. But then I got an opportunity with Demetri Martin's show, and I just couldn't pass it up. So I decided to move, and he was actually the first person I saw when I came out to LA. I remember he drove out to Marina Del Rey, where I was staying with my aunt, which I had no concept of where that was in comparison to Los Angeles.
Not very close.
Yeah, so now I know it was a good favor that he came out and took me out to dinner and just made me feel at home. And then pretty much every weekend I would go to their improv show at UCB on Sundays and hang out with those guys, the Derek guys that I'm friends with. And they were great. I really I can't say I'm even now feeling Los Angeles, but they told me to move to the East Side, and I've done that, so I'm a little bit better.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down in Larchmont with Megan Ganz, who, as you heard her just mention, has written for Important Things with Demetri Martin, has written for and edited for The Onion, and currently writes for the NBC comedy Community. Now, when you were ensconced in New York, having done school there, having locked into the New York life, Los Angeles represented to you what? At your New Yorkiest moment, mind you.
Yeah, you know what? It's more about what New York represented to me. New York was just the first place that I moved. I grew up in Michigan and I actually went to college in Michigan. And then I moved out to New York, and it was the first place I'd ever been to where I immediately felt it at home the moment that I got off the subway. And it just felt like, I compare it to moving into a furnished apartment as opposed to a unfurnished apartment. It's just, New York is all laid out for you. It's ready for you to explore. You don't have to have anything to do in order to start exploring the city. If you need to go to the pharmacy, you walk past 3 bars on your way there. And so you just naturally explore it. Whereas in Los Angeles, I came out here, and my first day here, had DC not taken me out to dinner, I didn't have any locations to go to. So, and you don't just get in the car and start driving around aimlessly. At least I don't. And so it took me a while to open up. But yeah, New York was just, especially at that age, I moved there when I was, in my early 20s, and it's just a place that's set up for everything being done last minute, everything being done kind of at the seat of your pants. You can leave your house in the morning and only know that you're headed towards a subway. You don't even have to know where you're going to go once you get on there. Everything can be thought of as you're doing it. And so for me, and I was starting out my creative profession then, it was really good to be able to just sort of not plan ahead for anything, just be able to go with the flow at all times. So it was more about what New York represented, and then LA I think it's just a little scary. It requires you to be a little bit more of an adult. You have to plan a little bit more. You're supposed to have like a nice apartment here, a nice home for people to visit you at. Whereas in New York, everyone just assumes that your apartment is terrible, and so nobody, really puts that much thought or energy into it. And it also has more of a college experience in terms of like, oh, hey, maybe I'll see you at that bar if I want to, if I'm stopping by at home or on my way home, as opposed to Los Angeles where it's like, oh, I have to meet you at this particular time at this particular place. And if you don't show up, then I'm going to feel bailed on. And so, yeah.
It makes total sense the way you sketch out the differences. But then again, I think of myself moving from Santa Barbara to here, and like, I feel like I came to the place, Los Angeles, where I could aimlessly ride the subway, meet up with people, and not know what I'm going to do necessarily. So it's like, is it more like you're coming to Los Angeles with a, in kind of a more adulty phase of adulthood, perhaps? We're the same age, I think, but is it more like, well, I came here for an actual career?
Yeah.
And that overrides all other considerations?
Yes, yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm older. When I was in New York, it was sort of the perfect time to be in New York, and then I moved out here when I was 26 and so I'm transitioning into an older phase of my life, and also having a career that I'll probably stay settled in for hopefully a small amount of time. And yeah, so I guess that probably has something to do with it. I think it's just for me, sort of mentally, I feel less nervous in New York because there's tons of people around all the time, that they're crowded near you, and so nobody is really paying attention to what you're specifically doing. You're just a member of a crowd, whereas in Los Angeles, if you're walking down the sidewalk, there might be one person approaching you from like a distance, so that person notices you and you notice them. I feel more fidgety. I feel more awkward here. I feel like people notice you more, whereas I could just get lost in crowds and in New York I would do things like get on a subway and just ride it to the end of the line for no reason and just sit there because everybody is doing their own thing, nobody notices. But if you're just sort of walking around aimlessly in Los Angeles, people, I don't know, they tend to notice, I guess.
Geez, if they're looking at me, I didn't realize. Now you've ruined it. Where would you find yourself at the end of these aimless subway rides, at the end of the line? I mean, what points would you get out at and think, huh?
Well, I would ride, usually I would get on, I lived in Brooklyn and Williamsburg, and I would get on the L and I would ride it to the end, into, oh my God, I almost said Los Angeles instead of Manhattan.
They haven't quite built that line, but it's coming.
They warn you about that when you leave New York. They say, you're going to start calling New York Los Angeles and vice versa. But I would get on the L and I would ride out to the 8th Avenue stop, and then the train, because it doesn't have anywhere to go, it just sits there for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then it starts going back in the opposite direction, and I just would sit there, and everyone would exit the train. You'd just be alone on an empty train, and can't get any cell phone calls or anything like that. So I just, it was just a nice little, I had my routines there. I'd also walk over the Williamsburg Bridge a lot. Sometimes I would walk to work, and I had more, I guess, just private time there that I'd figured out.
I would interpret these kind of trips by foot or by subway to myself as ways to get in kind of a mind space where more ideas bubble up. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, I've always found that walking helps me because I'm a very sort of fidgety, anxious person. So in New York, it was nice because I would get it out of my system a little bit with all of the walking before I would show up at work. And also at the Onion, we didn't work quite as long hours. We would come together just for meetings to talk about whatever we had to do that day, but then we would usually be gone by 3 or so. Whereas at Community, I'll show up at 10 and I might not leave till the next day. And we're sitting in the same room all day, and so I've taken it out more in doodling and like doing origami and stuff like that because I can't just sit still. And so, yeah, I think I just have to occupy my body so that my mind is free to do something else. And at Demetri's show, Demetri is a big fan of different types of learners. And so he understands, like, some people learn kinetically, which means like you think better when you're moving. So he would have things in the office that we could, like little exercise things, but he would also be fine if he gave us an assignment to come up with a certain amount of sketches or something. He would say, oh, you can just go for a walk. And so I would just walk around and then I would just write down ideas as I had them. But yeah, for me, it just helps deal with some of the anxiety, I guess, that comes up.
Demetri is a fan of different types of learners and that he likes to hire different types of learners, or what exactly does that mean?
He does. He hired a bunch of different types of writers, but he also just he knows about the different types of learners, and so he would talk to us about it and say, if you guys are the types of people that work better when you're listening to music, or you have to leave the office every once in a while, or there's just, I can't even remember all the different types. He had some book that he was talking about.
Anybody who ever struggled against the boundaries of school, then, we could say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Were you that?
I was actually a really good student, but I was bored a lot. And actually, when I was 15, my mom took me to a therapist to see if I had ADD, and the woman gave me the test, and at the end she said, well, I think you do have some attention problems, but I think it's mostly because you're bored. And I didn't have a hard time in high school. I was one of those learners who could just cram for everything at the last minute and do fine, so I would get all A's. And it wasn't until college when I started pursuing specifically comedy, and I would take classes in comedy, that there was a subject matter that was interesting enough for me to stay focused on it for long periods of time. But if you put me in a math class, my mind is just going to go all over the place. Not to say that I can't do the work, but I'm not going to be paying attention to you as you're talking. So it's always been helpful to me to have these. I've always been doing, since I was in the second grade, I would do like origami. I would always be doodling or like ripping pieces of paper at my desk, things like that.
What don't coastal types, I guess, know about what it's like to grow up in Michigan?
Oh, that's a good question. I was thinking about the other day that now that I've been in Los Angeles and New York for a while, I think about how when I was younger, this is such a silly thing, but I used to like vegetables only when they were soft and tasted kind of like meat. Like my mom would make them in roasts and things, and so they would taste like chicken and be soft. And then now you're living in a city for a while, and you're like, oh yeah, vegetables tend to not be just cooked until they're mushy.
I've heard that's a bastion, though, of upper Midwest cooking from friends who grew up there. Like that's kind of a thing there. No?
Yeah. My mom used to make a lot of roasts and like vegetables, and we'd have potatoes and stuff in them. What else? It's really friendly. Everyone knows this, but I remember I came back from New York to Michigan the first time after I'd been living in New York for a year or so, and I was walking down the street and somebody waved at me, and I immediately thought, what do you want? Who are you? Do I know you? Yeah. And so it is really friendly. I grew up in a pretty small town, so I was fairly bored for most of it. I had this feeling when I was in grade school and high school, that I was going to go to college, and I couldn't wait, and I just sort of knew that I wasn't really going to like anything until I got there. And I had been to Ann Arbor a few times when I was younger, which is where I went to school, and it was just a little bit more liberal, a little bit more I don't know, it was a different kind of city, and it had more of a city feel as compared to Kalamazoo, where I grew up. And so I just couldn't wait to get there. And as soon as I got there, there's independent movie theaters there, and there's independent bookstores, and you can finally get access to all this culture. Like I remember in Ann Arbor, you could actually buy The Onion, which was a huge thing for me because I could only ever get it if I went to Chicago, and then it was online, obviously. But so that was there was just more access. But I would have stayed in Ann Arbor if I could have done TV writing or humor writing there. Kalamazoo was probably too small for me. I feel like I probably should be in a bigger city than that.
Since you have professional experience in sitcoms, I'll frame this way. How accurate or inaccurate is it to get an idea of Michigan life from watching Home Improvement? I guess that's my closest touchstone. Remember that show?
Yeah, I used to watch that all the time.
Is there any pride about that show in Michigan? Like, representing? Or, was it shot here? I don't even know.
There's pride specifically in Tim Allen because he went to school. He went to, Western Michigan, I think, where my mom works now. And so I feel like there was a lot of pride in him. I feel like that's probably pretty close to what growing up in Michigan. It's like just, it's your average suburban place. Pretty freezing during the winter. They looked like, I remember that show had actual winters on it. Like in the Christmas time, there'd be snow outside, and they would deal with the fact that it was winter. Whereas, for instance, on Community, it's even on our Christmas episodes, you don't really see snow. There's probably, probably pretty close. Slightly larger families, like 3, 4, 5 kids usually. I didn't remember watching that and thinking like, oh, I have no idea how these people are living. It felt pretty close.
You have this phrase I've heard you say on a few other podcasts about your discovering of The Onion at 13, I believe, that it was like the sky opening up. And that's dramatic, but my main question here is, at 13, as I said, we're about the same age, and at 13, The Onion to me was something I would occasionally hear someone's older brother at college mention, or like a cool barista, but it was not in my world. Like I would have to drag it into my world, and it was too far away to sort of get at 13. How were you? Was it geographical? Like, was The Onion more of a presence there because it started in that region of the country, or how was The Onion entering your life that early?
That's a good question. My mom bought me a book, an Onion book. That's how I first saw it. She bought me their first, I think it's called Dispatches from the 10th Circle or something like that. Very poorly put together Onion book, but gave me the gist of it. But how I accessed it, I think my humor, learning, my education in humor was a little bit accelerated because my dad was always really interested in humor. So when I was very young, before I could even really understand what was going on, he was showing me Marx Brothers movies. So by the time I was 10 or 11, I was reading Mad Magazine and seeking sort of like a more adult humor. And at that time, Mad Magazine was even more, I would say, skewed towards adult, because they were still pursuing the guys that had read them in like the 70s, that generation, and now they've sort of split. So now it seems more of like a kids magazine because they're advertising to children and those adults still. So by 10 or 11, but I liked Mad Magazine, but I liked when they would be more satirical. I was never very interested in writing very zany stuff. I always loved Groucho Marx and his sort of turns of phrase. I love puns, and I always interested in really, couplets of dialogue where one person's playing off the other. So I think I was seeking out something a little bit more satirical, a little bit more biting. And even though I couldn't understand The Onion when I first got it, not all parts of it, I liked that I couldn't understand it because I felt like that meant that it was something that I had to aspire to, and not just something that was just for babies, I guess, is the way I perceived it at the time. And so I started reading it a lot. And also I think that they just have a little bit of a drier style, and I was a very shy kid up until the time I was maybe like 15 or 16. Nobody would have told you that they thought I was funny, because I wasn't. I just didn't speak to anybody. I wasn't trying to be funny out loud. I would just have these thoughts running through my head, sarcastic thoughts, but I was always really polite and a good kid, so I would never say any of them out loud because I realized that they would be rude. And then, in high school, I started doing stuff with theater and started exploring more comedy, and then felt comfortable with saying some of the things I'd been thinking out loud, and then people started reacting to them well. And so then I got more confidence in that area. So maybe I just preferred that The Onion didn't feel like it was shoving it down your throat. It felt like it was, and that's what I've always liked about The Onion. It's just objective news, and they're not commenting on what's happened. They're not saying that it's insane. They're barely even pointing out the absurdity of it. They're just reporting what they consider to be the news. And if you think that it's funny, well, then you're allowed to take that away from it. And
no elbow in the ribs.
Yeah, exactly. It's not forcing you to notice, which I've always had a problem with. That just sort of like rubbing your nose in the comedy.
What's more, it doesn't announce this is comedy. You don't find the word comedy anywhere in The Onion. And it's a little like, if I see stand-up, I always really want to appreciate stand-up, but there's always that barrier of, this is going to be funny. You showed up because you're going to laugh. Check out this guy. This guy's going to make you laugh. And it's always like, yeah, we'll see,
Yeah.
That it all similar to this phenomenon you're describing where you... Is it about expectations, I guess? And the fact that The Onion does not set up expectations so it was able to hit you at the right angle? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I always feel like comedy is best served when you're not overextending yourself to make it, when it seems like it's sort of happening naturally. That's why I think I prefer lower budget comedy, watching lower budget comedies that sort of look like you could believe that just two guys took out cameras and just started taping each other, for instance. Like I watch Peep Show on the BBC and things like that feel very low budget, because I always feel like humor, It's right. When you're trying too hard, you're naturally predisposed not to laugh at that person because you feel kind of bad for them. Like you worry about that person and they're going out on a ledge and, I hope that this joke sticks because if it doesn't, then they're going to look really foolish. Whereas opposed if you just are sort of presented with it, like you're saying, The Onion just sort of puts it out here. It's a non abrasive newspaper. It's not all in your face. It's just the news. You can flip through it if you want, and if you don't want to, that's fine. And I think when you approach comedy like that, you're more likely to have people have an honest reaction because like you say, you're not sitting in a comedy club and knowing that this person is looking at you and knowing that if they don't hear you laugh, then there's going to be an issue.
And the humor of The Onion so much to me seems like satire of the news media itself. I mean, how well did that part play with a teenage Megan Ganz? Were you one of these news kids who just was news savvy and could laugh at what seems to me to be the lion's share of The Onion satire, or how did that go?
I wasn't very news savvy. I had to start reading the news a lot more, current events, when I was working there, and I've since given up again. But I think, like I said, I think I probably read it, and if I didn't understand something, I liked having to go look up stuff and figure it out. I like being challenged in that way. I never really read the newspaper. I mean, I read the comic strips when I was younger. I pretty much just stole those from my parents and went off with them. I think the thing about The Onion, though, is that a lot of times these news satires are based on everyday events that you've gone through, experiences that you've gone through yourself. So we'll do something like Al Gore practices presidential speech in his bathroom mirror. I can't remember the exact wording of that, but something like that. And you don't need to know who those people are in order to understand that situation, what it feels like to want something really bad and practice it to yourself. So I think that was my access point. And actually, I probably learned more about the news from reading The Onion and having to go investigate who those people were than the opposite way.
Now, with a shift from being an Onion enthusiast to working at The Onion, tell me about the change in your thinking about what exactly The Onion is satirizing. I'm sure you had plenty of ideas while a reader, but when you started working there, what came clear to you about the Onion mindset? I guess I'll use a phrase that broad.
Well, it wasn't so much what they were satirizing as I thought I had a really good handle on their tone because I'd read it for so many years. And I remember the first piece I turned in, the first article, I was sitting in the meeting the drafts meeting where everyone reads each other's drafts and then we come together and we give notes before we do our second drafts. And this was the first thing I'd ever turned in, so I was very nervous about it. And I worked on it probably for like 18 solid hours or something like that, just first draft, and turned it in. And I remember their first note was, yeah, this is kind of jokey. And I was thinking, oh, good, I'm being really funny. And they were like, no, it seems like you're in on the joke and we're never supposed to be in on the joke. And I was mortified because I thought, of course, that, I've read The Onion for so long, I know exactly what they do. But it's really, it took me about a year to learn their style, which is the news speak itself never passes judgment on the people or facts that it's reporting on. It just reports the facts, and if they're absurd, then they are absurd. But you would never say, like, so-and-so, he said stupidly, or anything like that. So you have to figure out ways to get jokes out without looking like you're trying to make jokes, if that makes any sense. You're quoting people, and it needs to sound like a quote that somebody might actually say in that, but it's still funny. So they're not making stand-up style jokes. You're not trying to go out of your way to get jokes in. It's a very dry, unopinionated style, and so it forces you to think more conceptually about what would be funny about a situation instead of what is funny word choices to put next to one another. And so it took me a while to learn that. I think that was the biggest adjustment.
Now, I don't want to ask you too much about a job you're not doing anymore, but one last thing about The Onion is, as a reader of it, I detect, I feel, I guess, a premise to a lot of it is, if you step back from the way the actual news media works and their various house styles and conventions, you'll find that it's often absurd and often does not serve a greater good. Do you think that is, in the minds of some Onion people, a premise at work?
Wait, what doesn't serve the greater good?
The way that news media has become, in the way it sees things, in the way it conveys information, the way that it picks and chooses what information to convey. Like, let's put it this way. A premise might be the media has just kind of got weird over the years, and maybe it forgot its mission at some point, and maybe we can make fun of it for that. Is that at all a vibe, or was it a vibe when you worked there?
Yeah, it's hard. It definitely is. We like to comment on news media. It's a little bit harder for The Onion to comment on it as it would be for, say, The Daily Show or Colbert Report to do it, because they can play video clips. So if we want to say, for The Onion, something about Bill O'Reilly, for instance, we have to make a broad enough generalization about Bill O'Reilly so that you didn't have to see any one broadcast of his in order to understand the joke. So we're more commenting on like kind of what's out there in the ethos as far as how people feel about Fox News, for instance, or how people feel about MSNBC, as opposed to, did you hear what that girl said on MSNBC last night? So I feel like we're more geared towards how people are represented in the media. For instance, like they did when Obama is running, we like to comment on the way that people are portraying him in the media, what people's fears are about electing him, those sorts of things, as opposed to saying like, oh, Fox News the other night said this. Yeah. So trying to think of like what was the last one that I remember we did that was specifically tearing down a specific media source. I can't really remember anything specifically.
It's less about specific media sources in my mind than just the way the media in general is, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah. I think I don't remember. We never, we didn't have a lot of talks in The Onion about like, oh, we'd really like to take so and so to task. It was pretty much joke to joke. If we got a really good, and that's how we kept it fair. If we got a really good joke about Fox News, we would do that. And if we got a really good joke about the Democratic Party, we would do that. And it was never, oh, we really want to tear down this particular entity. Although I think there was a big question when like Twitter came out, for instance, what we thought of Twitter. And originally I felt like the paper was a little bit more, oh, Twitter's dumb, we don't want to get involved, like it seems like a passing fad and that sort of stuff. But there were a few of us that were like, no, guys, this isn't going away. And now it's interesting because they had that whole thing with the Onion's account and tweeting stuff about Congress, and then Congress was like getting involved with whether or not it was illegal for them to be saying that there was like a shooting in the Capitol or something like that. There was a whole controversy. It's kind of funny that they've been on Twitter for so long.
From The Onion, you've gone on to work for Demetri Martin and the creator of Community, Dan Harmon. Both regarded, the public seems to have decided they're both noted television eccentrics. I don't know. What is that? What is that perception? Do you see that as grounded in a kind of reality, or just sort of like, hey, those guys who do weird things on TV? Hey,
Well, Demetri is exactly what you would think he would be like to work for. He's, very visually oriented. He does do a lot of drawings. He thinks about things. I remember he would put all of our sketch ideas in sort of a flow chart and have like all of these symbols for what types of sketches there were, and that's how he kept it oriented in his brain. And we would be, for instance, walking around outside and he would see a sign and he would transpose the letters in it to make something. And I was like, wow, you really can't shut that off, huh? That's just in you all the time. But he was a really good employer, and I wouldn't say that he's eccentric as far as a boss. He was a really good boss. And Dan, on the other hand, is more, I would say, like an eccentric around the office, as that you wouldn't maybe expect from what he produces, because obviously the show has a lot of, well, that's not to say, because it has a lot of heart and it's very emotional, and he's a very emotional person too. But his eccentricities are, he's known for getting his way, regardless of whether, NBC brass or whoever want him to. He's also cares a lot about the show, and we work really hard at it, lots of long hours. he's also really willing to take any idea. I mean, one of the writers, Chris McKenna, pitched him that My Dinner with Andre episode, which I feel like on a lot of shows would have just been, somebody would have just said, no, that sounds boring. Why would we do an episode like that? And Dan loves that sort of stuff. You can pitch him, oh, I want to put them all in a room for the whole day, or, oh, we want an entire episode where they're playing a video game, or, oh, we want, like, for instance, the Chaos Theory episode, that was an idea he had that he pitched to me about, let's do an episode where you repeat the same thing 4 or 5 times. And the nice thing is that he has that I think there's something about him. He has the confidence or the brash ego. I don't know which it is, to think, oh yeah, we can do that. We can make that interesting. No problem.
I should confess that I didn't see, until watching Community for this interview, I hadn't seen a sitcom of any kind, I think, for about a decade. And what would I get wrong by taking Community as a model for how sitcoms are these days?
Oh, wow. Well, almost everything. I don't think that there's any other sitcoms like Community as far as changing the structure, not being afraid to be a different TV show every week. A lot of sitcoms you can say, oh, well, that's a mockumentary format, or, oh, that's your standard, like, multicam setup. And the thing of it is, oh, these people all work at this place, or they all go to this restaurant, and those are but ours is, and it was funny, I was on set the other day, for instance, and there was a new crew member who I think was just helping out with lighting, and he came up to me and said, hey, what's this show about? And I said, oh, it's about 7 community college students that take classes together. And then he looks around, and we had this insane set, which I can't talk about without blowing the episode, but it just looked like absolute insanity everywhere. And he looks at the set and looks back at me, and I said, you kind of have to watch the show to get it, because it's never the same thing twice. I mean, yes, it is about these people that go to a community college, but we've also had, like I said, episodes where they sit around a table, they roll a set of dice, and nothing happens in the episode, technically, until the very end. And then that's supposed to be the real timeline, so that's what actually happens. And if you were to say it's about a community college and somebody would watch that episode, they would have no idea what was going on. So I don't think it is a good model for everything. I think that it's a model of the way that things should be going, because with every passing generation, people are becoming more knowledgeable about the history of sitcoms. Obviously, kids that today have been growing up watching the sort of sitcom formats that we're all used to, and so they're going to be bored. They need people to say. I mean, that's what drew me to Community first. Was I watched season 1 just like a fan, like everyone else, and there was an episode where Abed says, oh, this place is just like a TV show, until somebody says something that they never say on TV, like, this feels like a TV show. And I thought that was so cool, because it was the first time on a TV show that they acknowledged that people in that TV show watch TV, and they're aware of pop culture, whereas you'll watch, Friends, for instance, and they don't watch TV unless one of them is on a TV show, and then they'll watch that TV show. But it doesn't seem like any of them have ever seen an episode of a show where somebody, for instance, breaks an item and tries to replace it with another item before somebody gets back. And it's nice to have characters that, when you find yourself in sitcom moments, are able to say, oh, I think I saw this on a sitcom once, because then you can advance the storyline beyond that and say, oh, but you haven't seen it go this way. And now that we know that you know that, we can move the storyline a lot faster. And I think in general, our storylines, we try to get to, by the end of the first act, where you expect it to go, and then move it beyond there. So if we do an episode where somebody has a secret and they don't want to tell somebody else, they're going to tell them by that first act break, because it's a cheat, kind of. It's a sitcom cheat for you to say, oh yeah, friends just keep these things from each other, even when it's in their best interest not to. So I appreciate that in our show. I think it's a modern, sort of a postmodern take of where we're going. It feels very like, I remember before I was working for this show, I was reading Chuck Klosterman's books, and just that hyper-awareness of pop culture. It feels very similar to us, where everyone that works on our show is a fan of sitcoms and wants to do jokes about sitcoms on our sitcom. So it has that meta quality.
What dangers does that introduce? I mean, how much awareness is too much awareness? Or how much self-awareness is too much self-awareness? I'm sure there have been a million conversations about this, right, in the office?
I think sometimes we don't want to be alienating, and you don't want people to not be able to escape into a show. But for me and for a lot of the people that watch our show who are incredibly internet savvy, it's more relaxing and more of an escape if you acknowledge that there is pop culture, because that's what they're thinking about all the time anyway. So if you're in a situation and people are acting like Star Wars and you don't say, hey guys, it's a little bit like Star Wars, it's hard for me to get invested in it, because I'm thinking, oh, these characters are dumb, they're not as smart as I am. And so, yeah, I think we mostly focus on story, and we try not to let pop culture referencing and meta qualities get in the way of telling those stories. But we also don't want to tell a story if and just avoid all questions of pop culture. Like, for instance, when we did my second episode of my first season, there was a documentary episode, and so of course we had to comment on the fact that there are so many mockumentaries out there, and this is the style in which they do things. But at the same time, we had to ride this line where it didn't seem like the entire reason that we were doing it was just to make fun of mockumentaries. You know, obviously you want to tell a good story within that space, but part of the story needs to be, well, at least for us, if Abed is doing a documentary, part of the story that needs to be how Abed feels about the documentary at the beginning and how that's changed towards the end. And both documentary episodes we've done have had these arcs for Abed about understanding what kind of format he's working in. The second one that I did, documentary filmmaking Redux, was more about if you tell stories, what's your obligation as a storyteller to use your subject for your own narrative gain, or should you be sympathetic to that subject and allow for the possibility of a happy ending if it's going that way? If you could not to be that's saying not to be so objective that you're being cruel to your subject. And so, yeah, so I find that stuff interesting, just as a layer on top. Now, obviously, there's all these other stories that are going on in those episodes, so you can take or leave that. I mean, I'm sure, for instance, my mother didn't so much get into the Abed storyline, but she can focus on, oh, Pierce is sick and he's giving all these presents away.
It's a conflict then. You want to stay relevant to the viewer. You want to reference the culture they exist in, and you want not to seem like you think they're dumb by pretending like they don't know what Star Wars is, but at the same time, you don't want to, and I don't mean to name a name, you don't want to become Family Guy,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
What does that even mean when I say you don't want to become Family Guy?
Well, I think more so we stay away from, that show does a lot of, we're going to say a joke and then we're going to cut to something so that you can see that joke played out. And I think that because we're doing single camera, we try to keep a narrative flow going that's similar to how things would really play out in real life. And in real life, you don't comment on something and then see it and then come back to the same situation that you're in. They do that on 30 Rock as well, and it's great on that show. But the show has a different dynamic than ours. Ours is about, theirs is about producing a TV show, so it sort of welcomes those cutaways and things, whereas ours is about a group of friends hanging out together. And so it seemed a little, I guess, egregious to constantly be cutting away. I think it's more like we don't want to be the type of show where people can say, oh, you're doing that community thing, like you're doing that thing they always do. But now the thing that we always do is that we never do the same thing twice. So I guess you can't stop yourself from falling into some sort of routine.
It does seem to have gotten the show the reputation that it's the show that can get away with anything. And what does it say to you about the way the medium of television is right now, that's a show that can be on a major network like NBC?
I think everybody's scrambling in this age of television dying and the internet taking over. I think people are realizing that the current television watching public does not tune in at 8 p.m. to see their favorite shows. They watch them online, they buy the DVDs and watch them all at once, they order them on iTunes, that sort of stuff. And it's a different television watching experience. It's more like subscribing to a magazine, I guess, or something where you get every issue, but you don't do it on a certain time schedule. It's like, that's how I watch TV too. I buy season passes to the shows that I want on iTunes, and then I get emails that say, oh, you have a new one. And then whenever I get around to watching it, that's when I watch it. And I give my money to them every year because I like their show and I like what they're doing, but I don't dedicate a time of my day in order to see it. It's more free flowing, and so I think a lot of networks are trying to figure out how to capitalize on a show like ours, which, although doesn't get that good of ratings, has an incredible online fan base and has really fervent fans. We do really well in DVD sales and things, but it's not reflected in people, like I said, tuning in at a specific time. Our fans are more represented by the fact that we explode all over Twitter, and that reviewers are really interested in us and things of that nature. So I think it's sort of a Wild West. I feel like TV is going to be moving towards more of a subscription-based format like Netflix, where you pay a certain amount to watch a certain TV show, and as long as that show keeps having episodes, then you watch those episodes, but it's not on a particular network. It's sort of show by show. So I think that's why a show like ours is able to exist, because it doesn't need to be like the show before or after it. It doesn't need to, it can be the sort of thing that's better watched all in a row, as opposed to the sort of thing that leaves people cliffhangers so they have to come back next week and watch it. So I think it's demonstrative of that. I know a lot of the fans that we have will tell me not only that they only watch it on television or only watch it on the internet, but also that they don't watch TV other than our show. It seems to be the type of show that people that don't usually watch TV like watching, which is, I think, kind of fascinating and interesting. I think it's more like that, and I think that it's quite likely that in a few years we're going to have to abandon this idea of Nielsen ratings being a way that you can judge how good a show is and how well it's doing, and moving away from that. I mean, we do really well on Hulu too, and they really like our show and promote it, and it's great.
So fair to say then that we were the last generation to actually sit down 8 o'clock on a Thursday night or what have you and tune into the favorite show, and for all the reasons you mentioned, there's a flowering of creativity, it seems, because people are doing less of that. Do you feel any sort of lament for the passing of the era when people would gather around at 8 o'clock, or nothing?
I don't, because I think that I've moved as soon as it was available to me to move things into a subscription viewing. Like I said, I was one of those people that jumped on it. I'd never liked being tied to particular times and places of doing things. And also I like being able to, have it just feels more organic to my life, watch it over my lunch break. I'll watch it while I'm waiting at a bank, and when television, when you're a person who television is such a crucial part of your life. I remember the TV shows that I were watching at specific stages of my life, much as in the same way that people have music that makes them feel like, oh, this is the music I listened to when I was in high school, and this is the music when I was in college. I do that with TV shows, and so it's better if they're organically woven into my life as opposed to sort of set times. So I don't lament it. I think I only in the sense that when I was younger, I liked coming home from school, and having this particular show that I would watch, or I used to watch ER when I was younger, and my mom used to let me stay up a little bit later in order to watch it. That sort of stuff is fun. But now that I'm older, it doesn't behoove me to be on a schedule.
Do you think of Community as a show that draws its humor from anything about its setting or mostly specific qualities of its characters, or is it a show more about a sensibility, albeit a very specific one, that anything could potentially fit into?
I think it is a lot about the sensibility. Obviously, we don't alter our characters in order to fit. We wouldn't say...
You're not Family Guy, after all.
Yeah, so we wouldn't say, oh, we want to do a certain type of thing, but Abed has to be all of a sudden really violent, and so we'll just make him that way because we want to do this movie. We would never do that, but sometimes usually what will happen is we'll be talking about stories, and since stories are cyclical, since we tell the same sorts of stories over and over through the ages, you'll be talking about a story that's good for our characters, that's something that they need to go through at any particular point, and then you'll start noticing like, oh, this story is kind of similar to like this type of movie or this type of story. It's a revenge story. It's like the Run Lola Run thing, for instance. We started with that concept and then worked into a story that we thought would be good for our characters, and put all of the emotional stuff into that story. But I do think that what excites us in the room a lot of the times is to pick a certain sensibility. I know it's a good jumping off point. For instance, like my first episode is the bottle episode, which Dan just said he wanted to do a bottle episode. It wasn't for any other particular reason than that he'd watched bottle episodes on like Star Trek and he thought that they were kind of cool.
I guess this is a famous thing, but we should also explain to people who don't know. I mean, I'm just realizing there's going to be some shrugs right now listening. So bottle episode.
Bottle episode is an episode of TV that's usually done to save money, where it's one location. So all the characters are in one room. There was kind of a bottle episode on Breaking Bad called The Fly, and I looked up some other ones, but the term was invented, I think, for Star Trek, and it was episodes that would take place all on the bridge. And it was done, to save money. But Dan just wanted to do one because it's sort of a classic type of TV episode, and it's an interesting restriction to work within. If you say to yourself, okay, they can't leave the room, well, that cuts down your stories, and it naturally led us to the first question you ask is, well, why won't they leave the room? Well, let's say that somebody lost their pen and they don't know where it is, and they know it's on one of the people in that room. Okay, well, that would be a good reason not to leave. So then what would happen next? And it sort of is a launching off point. And I was really interested in that particular idea because I'd never written for TV, for a sitcom before when I started, so I had no concept of how to write a 30-page script. And so it felt kind of like a play, like it was approachable. Here are all your characters. They're stuck in this room. You can't get them out of the room. Anybody can talk at any time. But those restrictions made me feel like, oh, okay, I can maybe do this. I can think of this because it's limited. So sometimes we'll start that way. But other times, we'll do something like, for instance, the Shirley and Jeff storyline where they're playing foosball in one of the episodes this season. We started with that storyline and we thought, oh, we'd like to do a Jeff and Shirley story. What do they share in common? Oh, they both have this rage sort of that seems to be suppressed by different things on both sides, her religion and his sort of too cool for schoolness or whatever you would call it. And so what could be an interesting, inciting incident for the two of them? And so you start thinking about games and foosball. And then we have an anime portion of it. And that sort of came out because everything was getting more and more heightened in their gameplay. And so Dan had this idea of like, well, what if it gets so heightened that it sort of shoots them into this anime world? And we thought that was really cool. And it worked naturally with the story. And so we'll include something like that.
It seems to me that the bulk, or I guess all of your comedy writing career so far has been based on using other voices, using existing voices, whether it's using the Onion's voice or using Demetri Martin's voice or the voices of these community college going characters, I guess. What are the qualities of voices you like to use the most?
This is actually a very good question because I'm now in my hiatus being faced with that exact question, which is I've always written for other people. I've had the good fortune, which a lot of people can't say, to be steadily employed in comedy since I graduated from college. But that also means that my deadlines have always been enforced, and also the format that I'm working within has always been predetermined for me. Now, at Community, for instance, there's a lot of leeway because I can come to Dan with anything from a zombie attack episode to everybody sitting in a room, and he's fine with any of those things. So I found a little bit more of my voice there, but I think I'm actually into mimicry. I've always liked reading things and then trying to speak in that voice. So at the Onion, I would do opinion columns, and they would be in a particular person's voice with somebody with a particular opinion. But my favorite ones were always the ones that were just sort of like language plays. Like it would be I wrote one, Act Now, to take advantage of my lower standards, which was a woman who was sort of using that infomercial talk to talk about my standards have never been lower. Now's the time, that sort of, and I always like that, to find pre-existing kind of dialogue and then to warp it into a different type of I don't know, a different type of speech. I did another one that was Mr. Contractor, Tear Down This Wall, that was just the Berlin Wall speech, but about a guy who is expanding his floor plan. And so those sort of language melds. I'm big into puzzles and things like that, so those things are right up my alley. But now that I'm looking for my own voice, I think it's just because what I'm drawn to when I watch TV shows, I tend towards a British sensibility in terms of quieter, I like quieter, drier humor with moments of absurdity, bursts of zaniness, as opposed to just more of I'm trying to think of a good, like you said, Family Guy, more of just overall zaniness all the time from top to bottom. And so I'm probably more predisposed to something like that, but I'm now over my head as I'm faced with this opportunity now where I'm going to need to write something of my own, and it'll be the first time I've ever done that. So it's weird. I guess I'll discover it as I go. I've found that the only way that I can get through stuff like that is if I start writing and just tell myself that I'm not going to stop until it's funny, and then whatever I find along the way is what it'll end up being. Because if I set out with a specific objective and then I fail at that objective, then my confidence is blown. But if I set up going, well, I'm just going to keep writing until I figure it out. Actually, DC gave me some really good advice for how to get started on a project, which is that you should title the project something absurd that you would never release, so that when you're working on it, you never feel like you're going to show it to anybody, because with a title like that, you never would. So he always makes funny puns or something for his titles, and then when he's all done with them, once he knows what they are, then he retitles them, and then it feels like a finished product. And I think that's a good idea. You just set out and say, I'm never going to show anyone this. And then once it gets good enough and that you feel like I have to show somebody this, then you know that it's something.
I'm developing a little bit of a theory here in my chair. While you're saying these things that are funny, and it seems like you find the most humor in, and this goes from the way the Onion talks about the subjects it talks about. It goes, it's present, and even down to the line deliveries in Community. It's maybe a mismatch between tone and content, like there's a certain imbalance that you like to strike. Is that true at all?
Yeah, I think that's my satirical mind. I've always enjoyed the idea that somebody could be saying one thing and meaning another, or saying one thing and be shown to be ridiculous by their very, speech. When I was still in New York, before I left The Onion, I submitted a packet to the Colbert Report to try to get a job there, and I had so much fun writing that stuff, because it's like I always wanted to be in debate, I think, too, and I've been attracted to the idea of being a lawyer and doing closing arguments, because I love making arguments for one point or another, but then there's this added level with Colbert where he's making this very decided argument to obviously a very conservative viewpoint, and yet by making that argument he makes the exact opposite argument. So it's a little bit of a puzzle, which I like, which is having where if you didn't quite listen to what he was saying, he would have all the markers of being a conservative, but once you listen to what he's saying, you see that he's saying the exact opposite. That's always interesting, and it provides the most what's the word? Play, I guess, the most freedom and in your language, because you have these dual things happening at the same time. So I like that stuff. I like people who don't quite know how absurd they are. I've always felt like that sort of person that I never feel like what I'm saying and what I mean ever meet up. And so there's something freeing about writing that stuff down, and that's the point of it. There's not supposed to be agreement. I always like that.
It keeps a certain question in the air if you do it right, like the question for the speaker of how serious are you? And even the setting of Community, after I graduated college, I sort of I put together the hobby of going to community colleges and like taking filmmaking and Japanese classes and stuff, just because it seemed like an entertaining thing to do. And in an institution like a community college, no matter how good it is, there's always that overwhelming question of how serious are you? Like, how, as a student, how serious are you here? As an institution, how serious is this? Like, there's a core ambiguity to the community college, and I guess it's highly exploitable for you in community. Or am I just reaching too far, and that's like isn't even a thing that's true?
Well, no, I think you're entirely right, and I think the ethos of community has always been. If you're a place that recognizes its absurdity, if you're a place that recognizes its own ridiculousness, nobody can ever knock you down from that pedestal, because it's a pedestal that isn't a pedestal. You're saying, no, we're not better than anybody else. Everybody's included, so nobody can tell me that that's not true. Whereas if you say, oh, I'm a very prestigious institution, I'm Yale, I'm Harvard, then whenever you do something ridiculous, well, then you're a ridiculous person. Whereas if you acknowledge the fact, like in our school, that there's monkey attacks and all sorts of nonsense happening all the time, and that's what we go here for, then I think that you're being a more honest person with yourself, with everyone else. And so I've never tried to, I don't like to set myself up for contests I'm not going to win. So I'm always that person that says, yeah, I'm probably not going to be the best at this. And then I found that I've had great success in things because I just sort of let myself off the hook for, nobody's perfect all the time.
It brings to mind some of the articles that I read. Writers get into sort of down into the rabbit hole about the dangers that can come from irony. Like if you deliberately undermine yourself, then you lower the stakes, and you're safe, but then you can't really accomplish anything. How do you avoid falling into that particular pit?
I think it's just about sincerity. I think if you're undercutting yourself, but you really think that you're a fantastic person, and I can tell that you're just being self-deprecating because you think that's what you have to do.
Humble bragging.
I'm sorry, but honestly, if you, it's just all about like the sincereness with which you approach something. If you're saying. But you can do that. This is the same thing with irony. I mean, you can approach something all the time like, oh, it doesn't matter. But if you're self-important about the way that nothing matters to you, well, then you're just as bad as somebody who goes to that movie New Year's Eve because they actually want to see it. If you're only going to it because you want to make fun of it, well, then, you're no better than anybody else. But if you I think if you just approach things and you have a genuine openness to what experience you're going to have there, instead of you've made this predetermination of, oh, I'm going to hate this, or this is going to be terrible or good or bad or anything, then who can fault you? I mean, you're a person. You're trying to have experiences just like everyone else. There's no bravado with which you're, trying to have a specific expectation, I guess. So I think our show, we just try to have, like I said, we try to have our characters be themselves so that nobody can fault us for forcing a particular viewpoint or forcing a particular movie style or something like that. And just try to have these genuine moments of sincerity in them. And I think also we try not to have a lot of mean-spirited humor on the show, not a lot of ripping institutions or people down, because that's easy, and also it's passing. If you spend a lot of time making jokes about a specific artist or movie or something like that, well, that person's probably going to fade away, or you're going to look silly because they won't fade away, and then you're making fun of something that is still here. So I think it's just like focus on yourself and what you're doing, and if you're really happy with it, then be genuinely happy with it. I think I've had, like you said, humble brag. I've had issues where it's like I will say on Twitter, for instance, genuinely things where I'm genuinely excited about my job. I'm saying, oh my God, I'm on set for whatever. And people will accuse you of bragging. But it's like, no, but I'm genuinely excited about doing it in the way that you are genuinely excited if your job is an architect or your job is a, nurse or whatever, and you say that you had a good day. And it's not because I'm in television. This is what I want to do. I'm just as happy for everyone else to do if they're doing what they want to be doing. But I don't, for instance, put up something and then say like, oh, I guess it's so weird, or I don't really like this, or isn't it awful when people come up to me on the street and say, I like your show or something, because it isn't. It's awesome. So of course you should say like, no, I'm happy to be making something. I'm happy that other people like the thing that I'm making, because that was the reason I went into comedy. I want, you want to make something that makes people feel better. And so I hope that I do that, I guess.
You've mentioned elsewhere your relative untutoredness in the minutiae of pop culture, in contrast to, say, like a slightly older, maybe a Generation X comedy writer would be steeped in since birth, essentially. What do you think that's given you, and how do you preserve that thing?
I don't know if it's given me any sort of particular advantage, especially not at this job, because like you're saying with the bottle episode, I didn't know what that was when I started. So I left the meeting where we were talking about doing it, went into the bathroom, and on my iPhone, like Googled bottle episode and had to look it up. I think it's been a little bit of a detriment at this job, but it's just I've had other interests. It's always good to have everyone in rooms that has different interests. You don't need 7 people in a room who've all seen Mad Max. It's like one person is fine. If that person, and also there's Netflix, I can always watch everything. I think though in general it's more of a problem, not that I don't watch enough stuff, but I don't tend to retain specific information. I'm not a person who can quote a movie that you've seen or even describe the plot to you. I just retain general feelings about things, general emotions, tone. So I'm more likely to be able to say, if you asked me to write something in the style of a Jane Austen book, I'd be a lot better at that than I would be saying any trivia about 90s television, because not that I've definitely seen just as much of both, but the one is more of just a general feeling that those books have that I'm very aware of, and the other, the specificity of it, my brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't deal in specifics. It's I always have to go back and update myself on buzzwords and things like that. If I'm going to, like at the Onion, we would write a story about, say, NASA, and I would have to go and skim a bunch of articles just to get myself familiar with certain words. But I would try not to learn too much, because you're trying to present these things to the general audience. So you don't want to be too specific. You don't want to be calling out, even when you're saying pop culture references, you want them to be broad enough that your average person can still understand what you're talking about. Or they need to slip in so that if that person hasn't seen that, they won't know that that's even a reference. So it's been okay. I've been, when I got into college and especially when I was at the Onion, I've been mostly opened up to more, I would say, like male interests, as far as I've been watching a lot more Westerns and martial arts movies and reading comic books and things like that, which I didn't have when I was younger, because I grew up with mostly women, and I had a younger brother, but he didn't get to decide what we watched on movies. So now that I'm seeing a bunch of that stuff, that's helping. I think it's just giving me a more well-rounded, well-rounded perspective as far as like what narrative storytelling is.
When you say you come away from something retaining the general feeling and you turn around and build comedy on top of that, I mean, that's the kind of core that if somebody is watching something you do 40 years from now, that will reach them, whereas a direct quote of Mad Max and a joke about that may well not, correct?
Yeah. That's why we try not to be on the show too specific, because you want someone to be able to, for instance, watch My Dinner with Andre and not know about Pulp Fiction or My Dinner with Andre and still have a genuine enjoyment of the episode. Maybe they won't know when those two things, maybe they'll have to go look it up, but there's still a storyline happening between the characters that can be appreciated on that level, and I think that helps with, it's timelessness generally.
We have iPhones, we have bathrooms, you can go to them.
Yeah, you can go in them and look up things.
I've been speaking with Megan Ganz. She writes for Community, the NBC sitcom. She's written for Important Things with Demetri Martin. She's written and edited for The Onion. Megan, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Oh, thank you so much. This is really fun.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. Keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.